as the dulcet tones of the guitar fade into the background, you are welcomed to another episode of the Religious Studies Project with me, Christopher Cotter, and him,
David Robertson. What have we got this week, Chris?
Well, this week we've got James McGrath speaking with A. David Lewis on religion, science fiction, Doctor Who.
Wonderful. Take it away, Dave and James.
Okay, James, hello. How are you today?
Hi, it's good to be talking to you.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I wanted to start, appropriately enough, by looking back. I know you are a man of many time streams, the future, the present, but let's start with the past, specifically 2011. In 2011, you edited and contributed to the collection Religion and Science Fiction, and I very much recommend it to anyone who has not checked it out yet to certainly go and do that. Would you mind giving some background, just how did that collection come to be? That is, what were you and the other contributors responding to in your respective disciplines that made the collection feel valuable?
Yeah, well, that collection, there's a lot of interesting backstory to it. It really emerged out of conversations across disciplinary divides with people who at some point were my colleagues, friends, friends of friends, and the network seemed to keep branching out further and further. But people that I knew and people that were friends of people that I knew, coworkers of people that I knew, acquaintances of people that I knew, all sharing a love of science fiction, all interested in the way science fiction and religion and their own discipline intersected. Mm-hmm. And so we started talking about these subjects of common interest and realized that this is really a fantastic area for interdisciplinary conversation and collaboration. And there really wasn't anything that was approaching the subject from this multitude of disciplinary perspective. Mm-hmm. So doing it in the study of literature and also talking about the religious aspect of that literature, or in film studies, or in religious studies, right? Any of those are things that might seem obvious. But there's a historical element. There's even a musical element, and ended up getting a musicologist involved. You can look at science fiction fandom from the perspective of an anthropologist. And there are so many different intersecting possible perspectives on this that it just sort of evolved naturally as I found myself talking with people about this common interest and floated the idea, what if we would actually put a volume together? Now, I would like to go on to say, now that the book's out, presumably it's okay to talk about this, but precisely because of the interdisciplinary character of this book, it was quite a struggle to find a publisher that would get on board with it. Because the question is, well, are religious studies people going to buy it? Are anthropologists going to buy it? Or, is it going to be, one of these things where Murphy's Law kicks into effect, and it's like, you've got something for everyone. So, of course, no one's going to actually buy the book. And so
it was ultimately published by Wipfenstock. Mm-hmm. Did you consult with a number of publishers before that, or just have difficulty determining which publishers and which and what areas to target?
Oh, I ran it by a couple of publishers before that, and it was interesting. When they looked into getting feedback on some of the proposal sample chapters, you'd get two different people with different disciplinary backgrounds saying sort of opposite things about the chapter.
Huh.
And so eventually what happened was, I approached Wipfenstock and I said, okay, you're going to send it out to readers, and I've got some readers suggested with various, and here's what's going to happen, right? Some of them are going to say positive things about half the chapters, and others, and going to say the other half are kind of weak or not as interesting. And the other person is inevitably going to say the exact same thing, but about the exact opposite chapter. And that actually happened. And by that stage, it was predictable. So it's interesting. We get a lot of encouragement from administrators, from colleagues sometimes, from different voices saying, be interdisciplinary, right? Collaborate, have these conversations that interact across the traditional divides. It's not always facilitated by some of our traditional approaches to publishing, I discovered, right, where very often a publisher has a niche, or they have a series that aimed for a particular niche, and so found that what it actually took was telling them, okay, precisely because of this interdisciplinary character, which I think makes this book really valuable, what you're going to find is that people reading across their, away from, as they get further and further outside of their disciplinary expertise and what's familiar and the usual way of doing things for their discipline, the reaction is going to be different. And that's to be expected. And, when you get that kind of feedback, realize that it indicates something positive rather than something negative about the book.
So instead of at first seeing this book as having a benefit in having something for everyone, or something to which everyone can stretch across their field to, publishers were initially taking that as a detriment. Were initially taking that as a detriment, that they didn't see exactly, precisely who this targeted exclusively.
I think there was an element of that, but I think it's also simply part of the experience of readers reading outside of their field and the usual way of doing things. As an academic, one of the things I've had privilege of doing from time to time is serving on committees, where you read, let's say, grant proposals or things like that from different constituencies. And in religious studies itself, of course, this is a field, right? It's not a discipline. And so one reason why I thought this was a good place to bring these different disciplinary perspectives together is precisely because in religion, you have people doing anthropological work in religion. You have people doing literary studies in relation to religion. And so it seemed a natural area to bring this intersection into focus. But one of the things that often happens on these committees, or when academics are reading proposals or applications or whatever it happens to be, is that very often you need somebody with a different perspective, a different academic perspective, a different disciplinary perspective, to actually say to you, okay, that may seem to you as a person with this approach to things to be, kind of vague, but when you're going out and in anthropology doing field work and observing, that's data collection, and that's perfectly legitimate scholarship. It might seem a bit, vague and nebulous if you're used to working in some other field, but this actually is a really good proposal for anthropology. And so interdisciplinary work, comes up in a lot of practical ways for academics, in administration and grants and all these things. And, we really do need to find ways of branching out more and reading more beyond our field so that we understand that sometimes a different disciplinary approach has a completely different way of, even formulating things, arguing things, making points and bringing data together and presenting it and things of that sort.
And it just when the book finally was produced, you included in your introduction that you suggested the collection was, and I'm quoting you here, a first step towards remedying a situation. The situation of the gaps between different works of science fiction, the gaps between different subgenres, different themes and issues and different approaches, as you were just saying, to and angles on the subject. Over the past 2 years, since this has come out, have you seen any progress towards narrowing or bridging those gaps? Have responses to the collection at all contributed to some form of advance?
Yeah, well, academic conversations in print, at least, in traditional print venues, are very slow and take a very long time. And so it'll be some time until we get, let's say, the next book that is really interacting with this book, So
once again, we're talking about time and space being relative, and in academic time, 2 years or 3 years is not a very long time at all.
Right. That's why maybe one of the reasons deep down why some academics like science fiction is that it allows you to imagine that you could travel 100 years in the future and see whether in the long run you're having an impact, because in the short term you don't always see the results of these things.
Oh, I like that.
True. That's true for academics. That's true for musicians. I think it was Gustav Mahler, wasn't it, who said that he wished he could conduct the premiere of all his symphonies 50 years after his death. It's usually when you start to actually get appreciated, if you're going to be appreciated at all. If he was right about that, and if it applies to religious studies as well as to composition, then we have I hope, a little while to wait. So we'll reach that point.
Well, so okay then. So admittedly, it's been a small window, but have you seen anything hopeful?
Well, I've certainly, it's opened further opportunities for dialogue, and of course, we found ourselves talking with one another in relation to the subject. There is a relatively new program unit, in the American Academy of Religion, focusing on religion and science fiction, and I've certainly seen different disciplinary approaches reflected there, and I've seen some interesting conversations emerging from that. And so I really do think that we are, even though there have been some major works published, but I think we're still at the beginning of seeing the full extent of what will be done by academics in relation to this broad field.
And once again, we have an interesting curve of time, space, a wormhole. People can, depending on what order in which they're listening to the podcast, they can either recall back to or look forward to the podcast we had with Gregory Grieve, with his own views on how religion and popular culture is embracing science fiction. So, looking inside the book, your contribution to the collection, what, to be fair, I called in a previous review, its oversized heart, a building proposition that the rights and humanity of artificial intelligence needs to be considered in advance of its arrival. Your contribution here drove all the way to questioning the existence of a human soul, or the possibility of a perfect Buddhist in the evolution of machine intelligence. It was heady. It was impressive. It was going all the way to what is the state of the person, what do we identify as the person, all the way to considering and forecasting the civil rights of beings who may not yet be with us or are on their way. What reaction have you gotten, if any, to the essay or when you've presented this material elsewhere? I'm also curious, since the time this came out, where's your work on this gone in the subsequent years?
Well, religion and science fiction really is a side interest for me. I suppose I should say that. One of the privileges I have teaching where I do at Butler University, we have a small program, and so I'm the Bible guy. My main field is New Testament. But precisely because we're a small program, we have a limited number of faculty, and there are so many things in religion that it would be great if we had a course that touched on that. We're all given some opportunity, if we're so inclined, to branch out and to offer courses on things that we may work on. And so it was out of an interest in teaching a course on this that I actually found myself saying, well, if I'm going to teach on this, I'm also going to spend some time researching it, and I'm going to spend I didn't know at that time just how much time I would find myself spending on these things.
Okay.
But it's not as though my main field is sort of Android ethics or something of that sort.
Sure.
But I found myself in conversations with people who think about these matters, and it was fascinating. I'm in a department of philosophy and religion, and we don't always have the same interests. There are usually a couple people in the philosophy department who have similar interests with the religion folks, but there are also some who are like, religion, oh yeah, that stuff. So it makes for interesting relations, but we all get along really, really well, as a department, as colleagues. But we don't always, have an interest in talking about the same thing. But suddenly I found myself talking with my colleague whose primary field is in ethics, and he does a lot in ethics related to war and warfare. And suddenly, he's noting that I've written on the subject, and he's been working on this question because ethicists are working on the question as well, right? Because we're at the point where we're capable of creating and are beginning to create machines which can kill which can kill human beings. And at the moment, we still kind of need to remote control them, but the extent to which they can be autonomous is it's near,
right? And
it's near enough, and it's possible enough using current technology that ethicists need to address these questions. Is it ethical to create a killing machine? Right? What kinds of constraints do you have to put on this thing before it even begins to fit within the ethics of warfare? And of course, people disagree about whether there are any ethics of warfare. But even those who think that there is such a thing as ethical warfare have the question of, well, what happens with this current technological possibility? We used to have to point things and fire them at other people, right? Or push a button and hope for the best. But things are changing now technologically. And so even to the rudimentary extent that we have artificial intelligence, and we do call it that, even though it's fairly rudimentary, as a reality now, people are exploring the possibility. The military organizations are exploring the possibility of putting those things into machines that can kill people. And so I really, have become more convinced than I was even then that I was right, that this is something to think about before the full extent of what's possible is realized.
And you were particularly thinking about it in terms of the questions we've long had about the soul, about humans' relationship to the ideal of beauty, to the idea of meaning. I mean, you don't keep it purely in the realm of ethics. I believe you tie it back to religion in some significant ways.
Yes, and my main interest was, more of a religious, maybe, philosophical theology, approaching it that way. Even that, of course, is branching out a bit from some of the things I usually do in, other areas of my field. But I was just giving, the conversation with a colleague who's an ethicist, as, suddenly there was this point of intersection between what I was doing and the kinds of things that he does. And so it was opening up yet other interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary conversations. But I'm interested in the question, and I think one of the things that is really useful about science fiction in relation to religion, in relation to theology, in relation to philosophy, is that it provides a wonderful testing ground for ideas. Right? You can write a whole story that basically allows for a thought experiment. And when I teach my course on religion and science fiction, I sometimes actually include a story of this sort. Daniel Dennett wrote this. Basically, it's a philosophical thought experiment. It's called Where Am I?
Okay.
Some listeners may have come across this if they've studied philosophy. But it's basically a science fiction short story where you have a brain being transplanted, taken out of a person, and the body controlled by remote control, and then the question of where is he? And then, they basically, find a way of, duplicating the brain so that, they've got a backup copy. And you have all these questions that it's possible to explore through a fictional sci-fi story of that sort that we can't get at as easily through any other means. Right? So this allows you to ask the question of, where does the human person reside?
Right.
If the brain and the body are separated, are you where you see yourself to be, right? Because your eyes are still transmitting the signal from there. And so if you look at yourself, you see yourself, you look at your arm and it's in this place wherever your body is. But if your brain is somewhere else, is that where you are? It really is, a useful thought experiment for getting at those questions of personhood, of identity, the kinds of things that philosophers think about and talk about. And so for religious believers and for those who study religion, the question of human personhood, questions about our free will, and I think rather than denying the existence of the soul, there's lots of different things that one could mean by that. I think really what I'm getting at is that in light of neuroscience, in light of other things, many people today think that if we're going to use the language of the soul at all, we need to think about such an aspect of human personhood differently than people sometimes have in the past.
I noticed that you're careful, or more careful, to use the word soul than to use personhood, because soul comes with such a loaded connotation and such a history where personhood may feel a bit, cleaner, maybe even more sterile?
Don't know. Yeah, I wouldn't think of personhood as sterile per se, but
Okay.
I think that there are plenty of people who would say there's no such thing as the soul, who would not say there's no such thing as a person.
Right. Okay.
And yet, the truth of the matter is that the notion of the soul was an attempt to get at a particular aspect of personhood. And so there's a sense in which, taking out some language that has maybe too much baggage for some people and substituting another term that has less of that may be useful. But there are many people who would say there's no such thing as the soul, and what they mean is there is no immaterial substance, which itself sounds self-contradictory when you put it that way, but no ethereal thing which is the real you that is separate from your brain activity and separate from the body and, possibly connected via the pineal gland, as, was once what was suggested, but it doesn't work.
I'm tempted. I know I was looking towards my next question here, and it actually deals with a character, albeit a fictional character, who may well have a soul, but different personhoods. And what I'm thinking of here is the title character to the Doctor Who series. And the reason he comes to mind, I noticed that religion and science fiction actually lacked a lot of mention of Doctor Who, which is the British science fiction series celebrating its 50th year currently. And it's also a frequent subject of your own Exploring the Matrix blog for pathos.com. So first of all, I guess I'd put my unexpected question to you. Does the science fiction of Doctor Who complicate what you're trying to establish between personhood and soul? Does Doctor Who, as he regenerates, takes on different forms with each actor? Are they different persons, in your opinion, with the same soul?
That's a nice way of putting it. One of the things that's fascinating about science fiction, Doctor Who has an interesting relationship to religion and religious ideas, and we can talk about that in some detail. But branching out more broadly, right, some would place Doctor Who, within the stream of sort of humanistic science fiction, and that in itself is interesting, right? Because the main character who gives voice to this humanism, so-called, is not human,
right?
And that makes things interesting, right? So it's really sort of personism rather than humanism, right? It's an appreciation for sentient beings,
entityism, maybe.
Right. Yeah, maybe, but that's very cumbersome to say, and so we call it humanism, and of course, he kind of looks human, and so we can sort of get away with it. But there's something very interesting just in the fact that the one who's giving voice to this thing that we might call humanism is not human, and that in itself, raises some interesting questions that are worth exploring. But if you think about, the other classic example of humanist science fiction is Star Trek. Right. Gene Roddenberry was very upfront about his humanism, and yet there's lots of talk about the soul in that show. Right? Question of whether androids have a soul, right? Whether Dr. Kirby, who transferred himself into an android body. In one episode, right? But they only find out that he was an android towards the end. Sorry if I spoiled that for anyone, but this is from the 60s, so you had plenty of chance to watch it.
It's about a 50-year spoiler, so I think that's okay.
So it's probably okay, but you never know. Some people get upset still. Fortunately, time travel, they can go back in time and erase their memory or something.
That's right.
But the question of whether Dr. Kirby, Captain Kirk, I think it was, who says towards the end of the episode, Dr. Kirby was never here. And there's a lot of talk about the soul, right? His person seems to have been transferred, right? But there's this suggestion that something doesn't make it across, even if you copy the brain pattern.
There's an irony there, of course, that since Star Trek features so much beaming, teleportation, transportation, where the person is molecularly broken down, converted into some sort of energy information, and then reconstituted on the planet's surface. By Kirk's own logic there, not to get on a total Star Trek nerd rant, we have the problem. Is Kirk actually on the Enterprise, or are we just getting clone after clone through the transporter of a soulless Kirk, or of a duplicated Kirk that has the soul reattach itself?
Yeah, and even if you take the soul out of it, the question of, this is something, those who want to live longer, it's an ongoing existence, right, that has continuity with yourself. Very few of us would say, okay, if I can have a copy of myself live for a whole nother lifespan, I won't mind that I experience ceasing to exist at this point. Very few people would probably go for that choice.
Right.
And so the question of whether in making a copy, via a transporter, really what you're doing is you're making a copy, right? And on one end, you're ceasing to exist, right? Doesn't seem like I think maybe we should actually be more sympathetic with Dr. McCoy saying, I don't want to get in this thing. I don't want my atoms scrambled all over the universe.
That's right.
There's a good philosophical objection to getting into a transporter.
And in the later Star Trek series and Star Trek The Next Generation, we have that same hesitation or concern expressed as a phobia, I think. There's Lieutenant Barclay, who has a phobia, is scared of actually getting on transporters, sort of an existential dread that even though the technology seems to work for everyone, it rarely goes awry. He can't explain why it strikes so at the center of him to want to avoid that one piece of technology, and he's an engineer.
Mm-hmm. And we have, Riker being, we find out that at one point in his life he was duplicated, right? Because
Thomas Riker, right?
Yeah. Ends up using a different name, right? Using a middle name, but basically another copy of the same person, right? So presumably, if you can make multiple copies using this technology, then it's a copy, right? It's not something that gets you continuously from one point to another. So again, it's really a philosophical thought experiment, and science fiction is great for this sort of thing.
Well, you've driven us from the topic. We got into a Star Trek conversation, and I wanted to direct us to actually a Doctor Who conversation for good reason.
I transported us, and I'm sorry.
You did. You pushed us into a parallel reality.
Yeah, I beamed us elsewhere. Yeah.
So let's start for people who may not be entirely adept with the Doctor Who phenomenon. It's it's a series that has gone on start and stop for 50 years with a variety of actors playing the lead role and a huge number of different writers and crews and casts. If hypothetically you were challenged by a Pathos editor for whom you write a great deal about Doctor Who, if you were challenged by a Pathos editor to explain why you pay so much attention to the presumably humanist television show about a time-traveling alien do-gooder in a blue box, what would you say to that challenge?
Knowing me, I'd probably make some sort of Doctor Who quip and say that the show is actually bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And that would probably just get me into trouble, but I'd probably say it nevertheless before I thought better of it. But I do think that TV shows, they reflect the time in which they're produced, as well as influencing it. And so there's something special about having the opportunity to look at a phenomenon in pop culture across multiple decades. It really does allow us to look and see, okay, so we see these changes, right, from the original, first season, let's say, or first few seasons of a show to 50 years later, what they're doing now. Or we see continuities, or, what do we see? We're often looking for ways to trace cultural trends and looking at something which is trying to be a continuous phenomenon and yet is trying to constantly renew itself and reinvigorate itself. It gives us a good opportunity to look at that sort of thing.
But more so Doctor Who than, say, the James Bond movies, or than, say, an ongoing soap opera, more so Doctor Who in terms of religion than Doctor Who in terms of cultural politics or gender studies. What makes Doctor Who and religion line up as nicely as it does for this longitudinal study, longitudinal watch?
Well, what makes it line up for me, of course, is that I happen to enjoy it.
That helps.
So, you can do that with, other things as well, arguably. And, who knows, if we get 50 years of The Simpsons, then looking at that might tell us, certain things.
We're seeing the beginning of the field of Simpsonology right now. We're living in the early decades of Simpsonology.
When we didn't really grasp how important it was going to be at some
Okay.
future point, or who knows. But I mean, apart from that, it's science fiction. Science fiction, means that you don't necessarily have to be realistic. And if there's one thing that Doctor Who, it's accused of many things, realism is not always one of them. A soap opera, of course, may not be realistic. I mean, how many twin siblings can a person have that die and then are back on the show again in the future episode?
Right.
But Doctor Who has this interesting relationship to religion, because it's asking about religion from time to time from a variety of perspectives. Right. I mean, early in the show's history, you have the time travelers, the Doctor and his human companions who are with him, arrive amid the ancient Aztecs. Can you change their history? Can you get them to stop sacrificing human beings? These questions that are sort of unique to a time travel scenario, right? And it's asking the question whether you can tamper with history and do so effectively, and does it create paradoxes and those sorts of general questions. But it gives you a chance to ask, what's the appropriate perspective of someone from our time, right, or the 60s as it happened to be then, right?
Right.
I assume this is not going to be broadcast in the 60s, but it's going to be broadcast. So
it is not knowingly at this point going to be retro broadcast into the 60s. No.
Only a Doctor Who fan would be concerned about that.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably, right? But what's the appropriate perspective of someone in our time looking at ancient ritual and ancient religious behavior? So that's one of the kinds of scenarios that can come up. The other thing that's really interesting on Doctor Who, and one thing that I often make a point of commenting on because it's interesting, right? There are moments in the show's history when the Doctor really seems consistently to talk about superstition, right? And to take a scientific view of things and to sound dismissive of religion and ritual and those sorts of things. And yet what's very interesting, right, is that oftentimes you actually get these entities about which beliefs are said to be superstitious, and yet those entities actually appear as literal beings on the show. Right? Can think about the episode, John Pertwee's era, the Third Doctor's era, seem to be characterized by that sort of rhetoric about religion, interestingly enough, and yet has a couple of shows, right, the Daemons, in which you have these beings who are actually aliens from another world, but apparently, as a result of their visiting Earth, when people saw powerful beings, that were capable of amazing things with horns, they weren't hallucinating. They weren't making stuff up. They were describing what they actually saw. And
so does that episode, at least the Daemon episode, does that legitimize religious beliefs, saying these people are not just whacked out coming up with crazy stories, or does it delegitimize it by saying, look, the faith you had in something that was supernatural is actually just super scientific, that these were real, but they were alien and are not necessarily spiritually aligned with any goal you may have associated with them?
Well, that's exactly the pertinent question.
Okay.
From one perspective, it might seem that this is saying these religious beliefs are literally true. Right? And although, Doctor Who is not, lots of science fiction, it's not just Doctor Who, is not being consistently scientific in these things.
Mm-hmm.
But, if it were proven that ancient people saw these beings, right? And of course, we could again go over to Star Trek, right, with Apollo, right, and the Enterprise crew encounter with him, right? These people actually had the literal experiences. Right?
Mm-hmm.
People who study religion skeptically, professionally, taking a secular, scholarly approach to these things, are not going to say that, these people in the past, we can somehow conclude that they actually encounter these beings and these are literal descriptions of experiences that they had. And so these shows, which are dismissive of religion as superstition, are also saying this is literally true to an extent that one type of skepticism would not say. And I think that's just fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Now, if people are interested in following this line of thought or other approaches to looking at Doctor Who through a religious lens, you and Andy Crome have a book out, Time and Relative Dimensions in Faith, and and there was recently a conference at the University of Manchester on Doctor Who that I believe was led by your co-editor, Andy Crome. What direction are people pushing different thoughts with this character, particularly what some people call the new Who, the recent seasons that have come out in the 21st century, featuring Chris Eccleston, David Tennant, and Matthew Smith? Are they seeing religion presented in a particular way with these three, and now a new incarnation of the Doctor post Matt Smith?
Well, I think we're seeing everything that one might have expected given the history of science fiction in our time, and religious perspectives on that and religious studies perspectives on that. There have been church conferences looking at the use of Doctor Who as a tool for spreading the faith, expressing one's own faith, just as we've seen in the past with things like Star Wars, right, where there are lots of people who wrote books about Star Wars and whatever their faith tradition was, oftentimes simply looking for Christ figures or using a film or a TV show as a parable, for making some sort of spiritual point.
Mm-hmm.
But we've seen that. We've seen the show popular with critics of religion, and of course there have been some great speeches in recent seasons and recent episodes, giving voice to, again, what we might call, for want of a better term, this humanistic vision, but sometimes put very poetically and very beautifully by the show. Right?
One that comes to mind is that when we have a powerful, I mean, he has powers beyond that of your average human. When we have a powerful last of the Time Lords, final alien Time Lord, he becomes a sort of a little god, or a sad and lonely god, as I think some of the characters have occasionally referred to the Doctor.
Yes, and what's interesting is that even someone like Richard Dawkins, sometimes, for rhetorical flourish, will say things like, as an atheist, disbelieves in any and all gods of any shape or form, anywhere they may be found, no such thing, right? But sometimes, when he's being a bit more nuanced in his speech, will say that beings like the Doctor or like Q from Star Trek, or, entities that are powerful but not all powerful, which in the religious context that's, of a sort that used to be, or sometimes called polytheism, these beings deserve to be called gods. There's no obvious reason to deny such a being that title, right? And so the question of, where does that lead? I mean, is science fiction making room for, sort of a new polytheism, as it were? Of course, there's an acknowledgement among most fans, I won't say all because we've all encountered those exceptions, but most fans know this is fiction. Right? It's not always the case that people thinking about their own mythology view it in that way. Although sometimes storytellers and readers have been far more nuanced, even in ancient times, than some have given them credit for. But that's another subject. Mm-hmm. But even appreciating these stories as fiction, right, they're exploring a cosmos that seems plausible to us, and in some cases that we hope will be the case, right? That there will be other beings out there that's not just a big, dark, cold void, punctuated with bright lights, but really with no other life. We hope that in this vast cosmos, just as we find connections that are meaningful on Earth, that process might continue, and involve, other entities, and involve other worlds. And as we think about those kinds of things, we give expression to them in our storytelling. And so even on that level alone, there's something that's parallel and related to ancient myth and ancient religious storytelling.
Thanks to James McGrath, and especially thanks to A. Dave Lewis for that. I think it's the final one in our current series with Dave Lewis, but I will be emailing him soon to see if we can get some more interviews from him, because I've enjoyed these a lot.
Exactly. It's great to have someone who's sort of fully ensconced in the religion and pop cultural studies milieu, producing some excellent work for us.
Indeed. We've got another series, or possibly series, coming up after our summer break, which will be from the end of June, probably. But we'll tell you more about them once we've actually got a few of them in the can. Let's not jinx ourselves.
It's a big moment, listeners, next week. It's something we've been waiting for a long time. It's something that was probably inevitable, written in the stars from the moment that the Religious Studies Project was founded back in May 2011, when David and I sat down and had a beer and tried to work out what each other's gameplay was. I've interviewed...
And what was wrong with religious studies internationally.
I've interviewed David on his new book, which came out in January. What's the book called, David?
It's called UFOs, Conspiracy Theories in the New Age, subtitled Millennial Conspiracism.
Wonderful.
And that's from Bloomsbury.
So I've done my usual titling with the interview and called it UFOs, Conspiracy Theories and Religion.
And Religion. I think it should have been called A Taste of Your Own Medicine, perhaps.
David does very well. He only messes up like 5 times.
If you're a regular listener of the Religious Studies Project, you'll know that every week we put out a response to the podcast, or almost every week. We always try. And we're looking for new respondents. If you want to be a respondent for the Religious Studies Project, and this is open to anyone, undergraduates, postgraduates, even, senior scholars, if you like, drop us an email to editors@religiousstudiesproject.com, and we'll add you to our pool of respondents. And you'll receive special, secret, behind-the-scenes emails from our features editor, Kevin Whitesides, telling you of all the interviews that we have in the can that are coming up down the pipe. So a little peek behind the curtain of the RSP, and we hope that you'll join our respondents pool. We need fresh blood.
Yeah, and this is not to say that our current respondent pool is in any way, we're not sort of cutting folk out. Just as the project has grown and as people's own projects have grown, people get busier and busier. So we're looking to add some new names to the list. A, to bring a fresh approach, but B, folk who might have a bit more time on their plate at the moment.
Absolutely, because all of our writers that we started off with, obviously the success of the Religious Studies Project has meant that they're all highly in demand.
Exactly.
Nowadays.
So, I think we've already mentioned Basser, Nasser, and Asser, but I've just mentioned them again. But should also say, don't forget about all our links: Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes. Remember about our Amazon.co.uk.com and .ca links if you're buying stuff. It doesn't cost you anything more, but we get a nice bit of the pie.
Make Amazon give some of their profits to supporting initiatives like the RSP. That's what I say to it.
Exactly.
But other than that, Chris, anything you'd like to say to the audience?
Just thanks for listening.